Okay, I'm borrowing a message from Dr. James Boyce entitled Renewing Your Mind. Now, I'll entitle the video The Mindless Society in Which We Live. So the thoughts that you hear are coming primarily from Dr. James Boyce. Dr. Boyce was a pastor preacher in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. A wonderful Bible scholar, an exegete of Scripture, an excellent speaker, preacher, and very intellectual. So let's listen in to Dr. Boyce, and I will make some comments as we go along.
Now, the verses I have in mind are Romans 12:1 and 2. Let me read them. I read from the New International Version, but they're substantially the same in any version you have. Therefore, I urge you, brothers, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and to prove what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will.
So Romans chapter 12 verses 1 and 2 gives you a great insight into how to get out of the hoax lie system. It's through your mind.
About 30 years ago now, in 1963, an Englishman whose name is Harry Blamires published a book called The Christian Mind. Harry Blamires was a student and then also a friend of C.S. Lewis, was stamped somewhat by Lewis and Lewis's concerns for apologetics. And in this book, The Christian Mind, he says...
So I want to make a disclaimer now. C.S. Lewis has been proven to be in the Cabal system. Many honest, good people really have no idea of how extensive the Cabal system is. And Dr. Boyce certainly didn't know that, and this man that wrote these books didn't know that. But please hang in there with me. Realize that I do know that, yes, even the main line and frame of Christian faith has been infiltrated. And C.S. Lewis was certainly one of those. But not Dr. Boyce.
Over and over again, in the first chapter, there is no longer a Christian mind. It's almost a leitmotif in that chapter. You begin to catch on to what he's doing after you've read it for a little while. And in the context of that chapter, he explains what he means. He says, it's not that there is no longer a Christian lifestyle. There are certain things that Christians do. And I'm not denying that, says Blamires. Christians go to church and have Bible studies and so on. And he said, I'm not even denying that there's such a thing as a Christian ethic. There are certain things that we believe we ought to do and other things that we ought not to do because we're Christians. But, he said, there's no longer a Christian mind. And what he meant by that is that there's no longer a Christian frame of reference in our Western world, but even in the evangelical church, by which we as Christians think differently from non-Christians. Now, there should be a Christian frame of reference. There has been in times past. In the Middle Ages, there was a Christian frame of reference even for those who weren't Christians, because they thought in terms...
For those of you that are familiar with the great work of Dave J. or Dave Johnson, Dave over and over and over again talked about getting the mind of Christ. The mind of Christ. And that is the key to getting out of the hoax lie system. Allowing your thought life to become under the control of Jesus the Christ. Take every thought captive, the Bible says.
Terms of God and heaven and hell and a life to come, and a lot of what happened in the Middle Ages grew out of that frame of reference, but we don't have it today. And what has happened is that evangelicals in the...
Now, I did some videos on the possibility that everything you know as the Middle Ages is a hoax. So again, Dr. Boyce wouldn't know that, and to be honest with you, I didn't know many of these things myself for many, many years. but please listen to what he has to say. He's got a lot of great information here.
The area of their thought patterns, which determine their behavior, really are virtually indistinguishable from the world. Now, it's a very serious thing, and yet it is generally unknown simply because we aren't thinking about it. And yet here is Paul saying in the 12th chapter of Romans that we're not to be conformed to the world. We're not to be thinking like the world, going along with the world's pattern of behavior. It's secularism, it's humanism, it's relativism, it's material.
Now, one of the things that's really important to understand is that the entire hoax-lie system is based on a simple phrase: the manufacture of consent. Manufacturing consent. In other words, to get you to agree to whatever it is they're presenting. And if you agree to it, then it's yours. Okay, so you have to stand up to the hoax-lie system and say, no, I do not agree, no, I don't want it, and it's not going into my mind or my temple.
Materialism, but rather we're to be transformed from within and actually have a Christian mind and think as God thinks. Now, that book was written in 1963. As I said about 30 years ago, things have not gotten better in the past 3 decades. As a matter of fact, they've gotten worse to the point at which today I would say it's not a matter of us no longer having a Christian mind. There's hardly any mind at all.
Okay, so I love this statement by Dr. James Boyce. It's just a matter of it, nobody having any mind whatsoever. And basically that's what you're seeing. Everyone around you is mindless because they refuse to do their own thinking. They refuse to do their own research. It might be a lot like when you were in school system and the teacher assigned homework. Now, occasionally you could get away with not doing your homework, but eventually it catches up to you. By that I mean, when it comes time for the quiz or the test, if you didn't do your homework, most likely you'll get a bad grade or fail. When it comes time for the end of the class to be concluded, if you didn't do your homework and didn't get the points needed, most likely you may fail the class. So it's because people are not engaging their thinking abilities. Now, another comment I might have is this, that the whole educational system no longer teaches correct thinking. Now, that used to come under the category of logic. Logic has been thrown out of the system. And I even remember when I was young and I was in elementary school, we had books that were called Think and Do. That was the title of the books. And they usually had some particular lesson, problem, present, and challenge you to think and then come up with what you're going to do. Now, people do and don't think. So that's kind of what we're faced with today, a mindless society.
That's really what our modern culture is like, which is what I'm getting at when I talk about mind renewal in a mindless age. We live in mindless times where people really are not thinking very deeply about anything at all. Now, a lot of causes for that. One is our materialism. We are secular in that respect. We think that the good of life consists in the things that we have. Materialism works against the mind, the spirit. You don't spend a whole lot of time thinking about things abstractly if what you think the chief end of man is to acquire as much as you can or to cruise the malls. When you spend your time doing that, you're not thinking. We also live in a society that is skeptical philosophically. What I mean by that is we really doubt that you can get to know truth. or come up with absolutes that have any meaning. And so if you don't really have any absolutes out there to be discovered, well, why should you waste time thinking about it, right? So that has an impact. We also live in a very fast-paced culture. You know, we race from appointment to appointment. We fly from here to there. We have this business deal to enact, and we have the children to take here and the children to take there and so forth. And we're rushing back and forth so fast that you really don't have time to think. It takes time to think. It takes uninterrupted time to think. You have to sit down with a book and read and reflect and so forth. And that's just not the kind of world in which we live. So we have all of those things working against us. And they're working not only against the non-Christian world out there, they're working against the Christian world as well. In some ways, Christians are busier, more preoccupied with things than other people because we have all the church activities that we have to attend to as well as the kind of things we do in the world. Now, having said all that, having talked about this kind of philosophical skepticism and materialism and the fast pace of our life, I do want to say that I think the chief cause of the mindlessness of our times is television. We live in a television culture. It's very important what happens to us as...
So at this point, Dr. Boyce is going to go into the whole speech that was given by Ted Koppel at Duke University called The Vanitization of Society. Now I have another video on the channel, The Vanitization of American Society. Vanna meaning as in Vanna White. So I'm just going to let it play through, and he will reiterate some of the thoughts that I included on that video.
Thinking or non-thinking people because of television. Let me tell you how I first got alerted to this and began thinking about it. A number of years ago now, it would be 5 or 6 years ago, Ted Koppel, who's well known from the Nightline program on television, gave a graduation address at Duke University. It was really a very impressive address for a secular person before a secular audience. Ted Koppel talked in that address about the Ten Commandments, and you may have heard somebody refer to it. One thing he said in the address is when God gave us the Ten Commandments, he gave us 10 commandments, not 10 suggestions. You ever hear that? And furthermore, he says they are the 10 commandments, not were the 10 commandments. And then he did, I think it was rather brilliant as well as courageous. He began to take the 10 commandments, especially those in the second table of the law, and apply them to the great scandals of our time. You shall not bear false witness, and he linked it up to the insider trading scandals on Wall Street involving Botsky and others, and he said, there's a command that has bearing on our culture. You shall not commit adultery. He talked about the scandals with the TV evangelists and so forth. He went down through a number of them and sort of recalled people to an ethical base. We need to rediscover ethics in our society, is what he was saying. Now, I thought that was very impressive. But what interested me most about what Koppel said is what he said in the very first sentence. Very first thing that Ted Koppel said when he stood up before this secular graduating audience is this. He said, America has been vanitized. Now, nobody knew what that meant. He was coining a word. It's the first time that the word vanitized was ever used, I suppose. And so in the next sentence, he explained what he meant. He said that's vanitized as in Vanna White. I can always tell how spiritual an audience is, whether they laugh at that. You see, spiritual ones don't laugh at all. They don't know who Vanna White is. I did not at the time know who Vanna White was, but I have watched her since. Vanna White is this very attractive blonde lady on the Wheel of Fortune game show who has this very difficult job. Vanna White stands over on one side of the game board.
Okay, commentary. Most likely Vanna White is an actual man, not a woman, most likely. Someone even put a little comment on one of my video on Vanitization American Society. You mean Ivana? And I wonder if the Ivana Trump is actually the same one that plays Vanna White. But that's just a thought. I haven't checked it out. If you want to check it out, you can do that.
And the contestants call out the letters that are going to be involved in what is spelled out here, what they're trying to guess. And when they guess one of those letters, Vanna White goes around and touches it or turns it to light it up on all the places where the letter occurs. And when she gets over to this side of the game board, she claps her hands. Now, that is what Vanna White does. It's a very difficult job for which she is paid an awful lot of money and for which she is very well known. Not only is she well known, she's imitated. You know that all over the world there are televised game shows like Wheel of Fortune that have a character named Vanna White, except they give her different names. Out in Australia, I was just with some Australians and was talking to them about it. They have one out there in Australia, and her name is Adriana. She doesn't even have a last name. It just sort of adds to the mystique. And there's a girl like this in Germany, and the German version, one in France, and so on. Now, Ted Koppel called attention, first of all, to how well known, how popular Vanna White is. He said if there were a list today of the 10 most admired women in America, Vanna White would be somewhere near the top. And then he said, but isn't it interesting, on the game show, Vanna White never says a word. Now, I've noticed since she does occasionally say some things, like they're running short at the end of the program, 10 seconds short. You can hear her say to the contestant, I think you did very well today. You know, profound things like that. But at any rate, Vanna White doesn't say anything, and so Ted Koppel asked the question, how can a woman about whom we know absolutely nothing personally be so popular? And then he answered, it's because we don't know anything about her that she's so popular. She's a beautiful image on the screen into which we project our own desires. I want to tell you exactly how he said it, because he said it very well. He's talking about Vanna White. He asked the question.
So in my video on the vanitization of American society, I mentioned how there can be an interaction between the individual viewing and that image. And I talked a little bit about soul ties. And I should have clarified that by saying that it's not so much a soul tie as it is a demon tie, that you bind yourself to the demon that is being channeled to you. Now, that's an interesting word, that all the television stations are on channels, because through the images, the demonic world can inhabit right in your own home or your own area and say, well, okay, that's what is being channeled. So the image is projected, and then the individual projects something back to the image, or substitute the word demon, and hence you have soul tie, or let's call it more a demon tie through the channel.
Is she a feminist? Or every male chauvinist dream she's whatever you want her to be? Sister, lover, daughter, friend, never cross, non-threatening, non-judgmental to a fault. Now, why is he beginning that way? Well, he wants to talk about television, and what he wants to say is this. We think of television as being this modern communication tool that is so wonderful that all of us know more about what's going on in the world and are better informed than any people in all the ages of human history. And he says exactly the opposite is the true. It's working against knowledge, because television is not a medium that is pouring out all this information at us all the time. Rather, it's an image on the screen into which we project our desires. You see, so we're not actually learning, we're projecting our desires on the screen and having sort of a vicarious experience with what we see there. Now, Marshall McLuhan gave the famous phrase, the medium is the message. And for many years I contemplated it and tried to decipher his thinking. But it has to do pretty much along the same lines of what is being brought out here in this presentation by Dr. Boyce, in that it's an interaction
between your inner desires and the images on the screen. Now, once again, those images can be empowered by demonic forces. So that's why watching certain things can be very dangerous to your spiritual health, because that interaction can take place quite easily for any of us.
We don't actually know who Vanna White is, and as a matter of fact, we know very little about anybody. Now he's saying that's what's happening to our society. It's bad enough that we don't know what's going on. What's even worse is we don't know what's going on. Now that's a popular way of talking about it. I use it to get into the subject, but let me introduce a more serious study of the subject. I want to recommend some books along the way, because the way to become a thinking Christian is to read. Unless you're absolutely brilliant, you can think of all these thoughts by yourself, but I'm not. I have to read, and I'm going to suggest books along the way. The first one I've already suggested is Harry Blameyer's book on the Christian mind, and if you like that and read it, I hope you will. He's got another one since, Developing a Christian Mind. It's come out more recently. Two good books to study, but here's the second or the third one I really want to suggest. This man is not a Christian, as far as I know. His name is Neil Postman, probably Jewish. Neil Postman, I don't really know, but he teaches at New York University.
Now let me make a plug, because Dr. Boyce has a book called, I believe it's called Renewing Your Mind in a Mindless Society. So he didn't plug his own book there. But he's going to go now into Neil Postman, who's very interesting and has a lot of very interesting things to contribute to this whole idea of the power of mass media. Amusing Ourselves to Death by Neil Postman.
In the area of communications, and he's written a book called Amusing Ourselves to Death. And that has a subtitle, Public Discourse in the Age of Show Business. It's mostly about television. Amusing Ourselves to Death, Public Discourse in the Age of Show Business. I want you to just review a little bit about what Postman says in that book. In the preface, he makes the point, this book came out in 1985, and he reminds us that it's just 1 year after 1984, and the significance of 1984 is that there was a futuristic novel by George Orwell by that title that projected a future age, sort of a utopia, but it was an anti-utopia. Orwell envisioned an age where you had an oppressive government. We have the term Big Brother. Big Brother is watching you. That came from Orwell's book. We have...
So what do you think? Has Big Brother arrived?
The term double speak, where you say one thing but you actually mean the opposite. That came from Orwell's book and so forth. Well, Orwell had this vision of a society, we think of it more or less as the communist society, in which people are kept from reading. Nobody's allowed to read a book. Nobody's allowed...
By the way, that's pretty much exactly what is happening, and it's hard for people to digest it, but basically speaking, you're looking at communism arriving in its full force here in our land.
To think, because the state is forcing them to do what the state wants it to do. Well, he says in the preface, we forget that about the same time that Orwell wrote 1984, there was another futuristic, negative utopia novel by Aldous Huxley, and his book was called Brave New World. And it pictured a world in which nobody read any books, but the reason was quite different. It's not because they weren't allowed to read any books, it's because nobody wanted to read any books. You see, in this world, everybody's taken care of. Everybody is happy. Everybody is entertained. They have something like television, watching them all the time, and that they're watching it all the time. They have a drug.
Or they had cell phones. And everybody's under the drug of a cell phone.
That they kind of take that makes them feel good. When they watch television, they sort of have a little thing they hang on to with their hands. It's called the feelies, that make them actually feel what's going on, and everybody's just sort of lulled into nothing. And what Postman says in the beginning is, look, we look at the former communist states and we say, oh yeah, there's that big bad negative utopia. Orwell really had it right for them, and he forgets that the Western world has fallen into the pattern of the negative utopia described by Aldous Huxley, you see. And then he goes in to talk about how it happens. He makes a point of contrasting two kinds of communication. He says there was an age when communication was dominated by topography. That refers to writing, type. And he said, you know, in that age where people communicated by words, they read magazine articles, newspapers, and began to think according to the kind of laws that you have when you write something down, people really could think. And they really didn't know what was going on. But he says the age of typography has been supplanted now by the age of television, where we're not communicating chiefly in words, though of course we do have that at the same time, but we're communicating chiefly by images on a screen, and that is not an age that is conducive to thinking.
So let's add a little further to that, not just television, but the computers and cell phones. So topography, or acquiring your information from reading, is almost gone. And I have to admit, in my own life, I do not read as much as I used to read. And if you're listening to this, make a decision to at least balance your life to do some reading, because that keeps you well grounded. It keeps you in terms of having logical thinking rather than just absorbing everything through visual media.
Now let me just illustrate it a little bit. Think back, I know you can remember back 100 years or so, to the famous debates, political debates between Abraham Lincoln and Douglas. Now, they were famous.
Okay, now once again, let me intervene here and say, like Dr. Boyce, I believed Abraham Lincoln was a genuine individual and everything said about him was true. But that's false. Abraham Lincoln was an actor who also played Jefferson Davis and John Brown. So he was part of hoax history. So I'm trying to do some disclaimers in this lengthy little lecture commentary so that you know I'm aware that we've been hoaxed even by our most sacred, heroic characters like Abraham Lincoln. Hoax.
That was sort of a high water mark in the politics of America. These two men would get out in the fairground out in Illinois or somewhere, and they'd have thousands of people there for the fair, and there'd be a little platform like this, and they'd have it all set up, and Lincoln and Douglas would debate the political issues of the day. They would debate the political issues of the day for 6 or 7 hours. And people would gather around and listen to them for 6 or 7 hours. People really knew what was going on. Furthermore, what they debated was picked up by the reporters, and by means of the telegraph, it was communicated all over America, and it appeared the next day in the newspapers, and people read the newspapers, and they really did know where Abraham Lincoln stood, and where Douglas stood, and where the other political figures of the day stood. So when they went to the polls to vote, they were voting intelligently. They knew what they were talking about. Now, you see, what Postman says is words do that. You know, when you read an article, you think about it, if you can still think. And what you do is you understand what that person is trying to say and try to get into it. If you don't agree with it, you say, I don't agree with that. And why don't I agree with that? And you think it over. You say, well, because he's leaving out this. And you begin to produce arguments that are to the contrary. And it helps to stimulate your thought and firm up your own opinions. But you don't have that on television. Television doesn't give you information. It presents pictures. And furthermore, it doesn't give you time to think about it, even if it did present information, because it changes quickly from one thing to the other. Let me illustrate a little bit how it works. Take news on television. That's where we would start, because we think, whatever the entertainment on television might be, at least we have the news programs. We get all this great news from the networks, so we really know what's going on. Do you know that the average news segment on network television, not the local television, our local television in Philadelphia is a joke, but on network news out of New York, the big networks, the average news segment is 45 seconds. Now, how much news do you think you can get in 45 seconds? You know, plus, not only do you only have your 45 seconds, maybe you could say something significant in 45 seconds if you had time to think about it, but of course immediately it changes to something else, and so immediately what you just seen is out of your head. You don't really get time to reflect on it. Sometimes it's tragic. I remember I was at Memphis a number of years ago. We were doing one of our Reformed theology conferences there, and somebody in Memphis thought, well, they had connections with a TV station. They could get us on to do an interview, and so they set up an interview for me on the Friday before the conference started, and I had come in the night before, so I went down to the station. It was Channel 6, as I recall, and they have this TV news show at 12 o'clock, noon. They wouldn't have put this on at night, I think, but they did it at noontime. And I was supposed to have a 2-minute interview. Well, I'm sitting there in the studio waiting for my 2-minute segment, and I'm listening to them do the news. And they're reading it off the teleprompter, of course. And here they're reading the first news story and the second news story. And then all of a sudden, right in the middle of it, there is a beep, 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 beep. You know, that's the clue that you've got a fast-breaking news story. Right, something had just come in over the wire, picks you up, you've got to listen to this sort of thing. Well, it was all on the teleprompter. It's a staged thing, It might have been fast-breaking, but it wasn't fast-breaking enough that they couldn't get it. Actually, they were ad-libbing this. It was on the teleprompter, so this thing comes on, and I'm watching this, and what it was is a storm that had struck some of the islands of Japan, and there had been a lot of destruction. It was a typhoon, a lot of people were dead, and cities were flooded and that sort of thing. Now, what you should have done if you were responding to that in a human way is stop and think in terms of the victims of the tragedy. It should evoke some kind of...
Yes, they're a death cult, the ones who run the system. And they love death, whether it's real, R-E-A-L, or R-E-E-L. It doesn't matter. And what Dr. Boyce is saying is that the average individual, if what they're saying is true, should probably burst into tears and weep. But that won't be the case because they'll go on to the next thing rather quickly. Now, once again, the system is based on hoaxing and lying, which means that the stories you hear of great disasters are not exactly what you think. And I did a whole series of videos on the Johnstown flood of 1889. You can check out those videos where I will show you the entire disaster was just disaster hoaxing.
Compassion in your heart. I mean, it might be half a world away, and there might be nothing that you can do about it, but here are people that are dying, or dead, you see. But that isn't what happened. This thing went on for about 30 seconds, about the right length for a fast-breaking, important news story. And then this announcer said, now this. Well, that rang a bell with me because Postman's chapter on TV news is called Now This. He says, those are the words you hear most often on network news, and you know exactly what it means. It's a conjunction. It's linking up this little segment with the segment that is to come, but it doesn't operate the way a conjunction operates. A conjunction links. That's the meaning of the word conjunction. This is actually a conjunction that separates. And what it means is what you're about to see has no relationship whatsoever to what you have just seen. Furthermore, it probably doesn't have any relationship to anything.
So when you hear that little term, now this, it's a lot like being in a standard shift car and they're saying we're shifting gears. We're out of first gear, now we're going into second gear, now we're going into third gear. Get rid of first gear, you're done with it. You had your 15, you had your 40 seconds, your 45 seconds for that story. Now it's time for another 45 seconds. And that's how the news broadcasts are composed, of all these now this, shifting of gears.
And so he said now this, and you know what happened? They switched to their version of the Galloping Gourmet. It was the local one there in Memphis, and it was taped in advance. The guy wasn't doing this in the studio, so they went to this little taped segment. And what was this man teaching you how to make? Teriyaki. It was ludicrous. You see, here we've got a real-life tragedy. Now we switch over to the other thing. We forget all about it because what we want to do is prepare a Japanese dish. Now,
okay, once again, he said a real-life tragedy. You know, Dr. Boyce would have believed it was real, R-E-A-L. And I would have too, before I was taken out of the system. So my heart goes out to people, and those people that truly believe all this stuff. I was one of them. I'd like to proclaim that very loudly and very clearly. But he's getting at the whole idea of how insane the news is. No matter what you think about the news, it's insane. You go from a death story to making food.
You see, what Postman is saying, if we're operating that way, we're given the impression that we know what's going on, but we don't know what's going on, and even if we did, we don't have any time to really think about it like human beings. What if the announcer thought about it like a human being? You know, there are a lot of tragedies on television. I sort of got into the habit in Philadelphia, when I see the news at night, which is not every night, but when I do, I count the number of murders that are the news stories. How many different murders are there? They're talking about that night? It's 5 or 6, you know, normally at a time. Not 5 or 6 people necessarily killed every day. You know, some.
And most likely there were none. Most likely. Because they're in on it. The police, the news media, fake stories over and over and over again to scare the living daylights out of you and me and your children and grandchildren. They're fearmongers. Now, Dr. Boyce didn't know this. I didn't know all this. And I believe the date of this lecture that he delivered was about 1993.
Spill over from the day before and so forth. But there are people dying, you know, and then they love the pictures of the body bags being brought out, and if they can get weeping people on the screen, you know, that's just great for television. What would you think of an announcer that was actually touched by that like a human being should be? You know, there's a mother that's lost a 3-year-old child. Random.
Okay, not just the people that are listening to it, and not even the broadcasters, but how about the individuals that are standing in front of a camera telling you about the death of their daughter or their son? You should see them in absolute hysterical tears, beyond question. But no, they stand there real calmly and tell you about the death of their son or daughter or family. You know why? Because they're actors. They're liars. I've been around people that have lost loved ones in tragedies, and I'm going to tell you something. They don't stand there composed. In fact, many of them can't speak. And they can't speak for a long time about it because it goes deep into their soul. So you see someone on TV telling you about how sad they are, and they touch their eyes. They're liars. Now, Dr. Boyce didn't know all this, and I didn't either. So, I'm only using this as a means of talking to you and hopefully allowing you to get some good information, as Dr. Boyce is very knowledgeable, and his presentation I thought was very outstanding, and I wanted to share it with you.
Drive-by shooting in the drug area of the city. And this woman's crying. What if the announcer recognized the tragedy in that family, that this lawlessness in our society is snatching away 3 years old, and he would begin to cry. Well, an announcer like that wouldn't make it on television. You get rid of him. You can't do that. Because they're there to sell goods, you see. And the whole objective of television news is to make it interesting, keep it moving quickly, go from a commercial to a news story to the weather and so forth. So you'll watch our channel rather than somebody else's channel, and we can charge more for our commercials than they can.
So remember, the Bible tells us the love of money is the root of all evil. That is what drives the system. The love of the money. And it doesn't matter to these hoaxers and these liars, because they get paid extremely well to hoax and lie you through the system, to lie to you through the system. So I think I'm going to stop this, and I realize this has been a lengthy video. It's not a visual video in that I don't have a lot of visuals in front of you except Dr. Boyce talking. But if you got to the end of it, I'd like to commend you, because it means you're able to let go of the visuals, and you can learn just simply through auditory, through hearing. And remember what the Bible says. How does faith come? Faith comes through hearing, and hearing by the Word of God. Thank you for watching this video. End of video.